It's 9 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. on this beautiful day. I'm Srinivas Gurajada, head of PEFA Secretariat. Welcome to everyone to this PEFA webinar as a part of series to celebrate 25 years of PEFA initiative. For your information, this meeting is being recorded. We have today Francesca Spuri from Switzerland, SECO, to make opening remarks and inaugurate the webinar. As many of you may be aware, PEFA is a global initiative of 9 development partners. Switzerland is a founding partner of PEFA initiative and has been a major inspiration to the development of PEFA Gender Supplementary Framework. Now, I request Francesca to share opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Srini. Thank you so much to everyone for being here today. I'm very pleased to open this webinar on gender responsive public financial management and the PEFA Gender Framework. It's fair to say on behalf of the PEFA Steering Committee, I warmly welcome all of you to this event, which is part of the already 25 years of the PEFA celebration of the PEFA initiative. I think with 25 years, PEFA is not anymore a baby, not a child, not a rebellious teenager. It's now more than a young adult. It's an adult that has matured, and I think in that sense, having also a stronger fundament when it comes to gender aspects and also climate and other important topics shows how the baby has grown up and is now an adult. Before I start, let me make this a bit interactive. I see and I have seen that we have participants from very different backgrounds. So I will ask you 2 short questions, one now and one a little bit later. And if your answer is yes, please raise your virtual hand. So we also have some exercises, especially for you guys that just woke up. We here in Europe are already quite warmed up. So I hope everybody sees how you can raise your hand virtually. So my first question to all of you, how many of you have already worked on gender responsive budgeting or related gender PFM reforms? Can we see some more hands? Yes. I think it's not too bad. Yeah, I see many hands. Well, that's no surprise, obviously, but I think that's so the easy question first, right? Thanks for that, and it's helpful to know. And we hope in the future we would have even a more diverse audience with everybody knowing and being familiar with such budgeting processes. Let me start with a simple point. Public financial management is not gender neutral. As is often said, budgets are kind of moral documents. They reflect priorities and determine who benefits from public spending and who does not. The way budgets are planned, allocated, executed, and monitored shapes whether public policy delivers equitable outcomes for women, men, or any other group of beneficiaries. While many countries have strong gender policy commitments, these are often not fully reflected in budget decisions. So on one hand, we have the policies that pretend or say that we have gender sensitive policies, but then it's kind of not reflected or embedded in the budget decisions or in the core PFM institutions. This is why gender responsive PFM is so important. It helps move gender from policy statements into the systems that govern how public resources are really used. This is not only about equity, but also about good governance overall, inclusive governance, efficiency, and accountability overall. As we know, in most countries, more than the population are women in a society. More inclusive PFM systems support better prioritization and more effective use of public funds because it reflects an important part of the population. In this context, the PEFA Gender Framework is very important Building on the credibility of the PEFA methodology, it proves a structured but also a very practical way for countries to assess how well their PFM systems support gender responsive budgeting across the entire cycle. Obviously, we cannot just look at one part of it, but need to look at the overall approach to budgeting and also its execution. It also creates a shared reference point for governments, development partners, and of course, very importantly, and I think many of you are, from civil society to engage in informed and constructive reform discussions. So importantly, it's not just a paper, but it's a living, well, not only document, but really put in practice and having this dialogue with all stakeholders involved. So let me ask you a second question, and be honest, it's okay. I think we are all not necessarily always the best students in class, that's okay. So have you ever seen a really good PFM assessment or analysis, diagnostics, that then didn't change much in practice? Would you raise your hands if that is the case? So I see, yeah, there are also quite some hands. Thank you. I mean, obviously, that's also very insightful and reflects reality, that it is very challenging of having a good instrument on one hand, good tools, but then really implementing it. So that's the hard bit, right? When starting such a journey, I think the diagnostics is only the beginning. This gap between diagnostics and implementation is exactly where tools like PEFA Gender can make a real difference. But we need to use it, right? I particularly welcome insights from the International Budget Partnership, IBP's work on budget transparency, participation, but also very importantly, accountability brings an important applied perspective from like the end user, from the citizens, showing how PFM systems are experienced outside government, outside kind of the formal system, and how assessment findings can support reform dialogue and the implementation in practice. I'm also pleased that the PEFA Secretariat is working closely with UN Women, whose global leadership and operational experience help connect gender policy goals then with the kind of the hardcore pipe system, as we sometimes call it, the public finance system. Partnerships across technical, policy and advocacy communities are key if reforms are to translate into real change. And that's what we want to see, all of us, right? I encourage participants to think not only about the framework itself, but how also about how PEFA gender findings can be used to strengthen transparency, accountability, and in the end, gender equitable outcomes. At the same time, integrating gender into core PFM systems is a gradual process that requires institutional change. We know how hard that is. It requires capacity building and sustained political commitment. Also very important, obviously. And I think to reflect that, and also sometimes when we see and have a low, it's important to think of it like a marathon. It's not a sprint. We will not get very far if we think it is a sprint. Because in the end, budgets are not just numbers. I think that's how I would like to end my welcoming remarks. Budgets are not just numbers, they are choices. And these choices shape opportunities, access, and outcomes. Tools like PEFA Gender help ensure that these choices are not only better informed, but also more transparent, more accountable, and ultimately more equitable. And therefore, you are all part of these systems that can make choices, that can influence that journey. And I hope that we all take something along and will put it in practice, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, or at least during our marathon. Thank you very much and have a great exchange today.
That's a wonderful opening statement, Francisca. Thank you so much for setting the tone with so much of energy and passion. And your support to PIFA is something very fundamental, particularly to the PIFA agenda and taking it forward. Let me now take this opportunity to introduce the moderator for the panel discussion and request her to take over the rest of the proceedings. Ermira Lubani from United Nations Women. As many of you know, she is a leader in the space of gender worldwide, and she has been one of our greatest support in scaling up the use of PIFA. And as Francisca mentioned, the gap between assessment and implementation, that's something which she is very clearly focusing upon. Thank you for Emira for kindly agreeing to moderate this panel, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Srini. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. It is really a great pleasure to moderate this important discussion on PEFA gender and gender responsive public finance management. As we all know, and we heard from Francesca, public finance, financial management system are not gender neutral. They shape priorities, they determine resource allocation and influence who benefits from public spending. In this context, I would also like to briefly highlight that UN Women, the United Nations Agency for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, has been actively supporting the application of gender-responsive public financial management approaches across the region, including through the use of diagnostic tools such as PEFA Gender. In Europe and Central Asia region, we have supported and engaged with PEFA gender assessment in Georgia, in Moldova, in Kosovo, working very closely with ministries of finance and national partners to ensure that findings inform budget reforms, policy dialogue, and the integration of gender equality into public finance systems. These experiences have clearly shown that diagnostic like PEFA gender, are not the end in themselves. They are powerful entry points for institutional change and more effective public spending. So, like budget are not just technical documents. They are policy in action and eventually determine whose priorities are funded and whose are really left behind. In today's webinar, we aim to provide a practical introduction to the PEFA Gender Framework, explore how it can be applied in assessment, and discuss how findings can reform dialogue and policy discussion. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. Please keep your microphone muted when not speaking. We encourage you to use the chat for any questions that you might have or any idea which comes during our discussions. And at the end, we will have time to give you space to discuss or raise any issue that might come to you while we are discussing. Today we will hear, as I was saying, an overview of PEFA Gender Framework from Mona El-Chami, conceptual groundbreaking on GRB PFM and the role of civil society from Maya, perspective from IBP on transparency, participation, and equity, and followed by questions and answers. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mona El-Chami from PEFA Secretariat, which she will walk us through the PEFA Gender Framework. Mona, over to you.
Thank you, Amira. Good morning, everyone. Just allow seconds to share my my presentation, just a few slides. Can you confirm if you see it? Yes? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So let me first just highlight the PEFA, as you said, the PEFA framework first. So the PEFA framework is an evidence-based measurement tool that assesses public financial management systems against international benchmarks. It examines the extent to which PFM systems support the achievement of PEFA's 3 budgetary objectives: aggregate fiscal discipline, strategic allocation of resources, and efficient service delivery. By providing a standardized system-level assessment, PEFA creates a common evidence base for reform dialogue on strategy and priorities and for monitoring progress over time. This measurement logic is also the foundation of the PEFA Gender Framework. So coming to the PEFA Gender Framework, or it's also called PEFA Gender Responsive Public Financial Management, GRPFM, or PEFA Gender. It is a supplementary framework aligned with the PEFA methodology that examines how PFM systems take gender into account. It assesses whether PFM institutions, processes, and information acknowledge the different needs of women and men and subgroups and support government gender equality objectives. PEFA Gender does not measure gender outcomes. Instead, it focuses on whether budget rules, documentation, execution, and oversight arrangements, including those that enable parliamentary and civil society engagement, allow gender priorities to be reflected in public finances, providing an evidence-based for reform, dialogue, and accountability. So as you see on the screen, this is the PEFA Gender Framework. It consists of 9 indicators organized along the budget cycle and accountability chain to assess whether gender considerations are embedded in public financial management systems. So as you see, at the policy and investment design stage, which is the first 2 indicators, the GRPFM1, Gender Impact Analysis of Budget Policy Proposals, it examines whether government analyze the gender impacts of proposed changes in spending and revenue policies, while GRPFM2, Gender Responsive Public Investment Management, looks at whether major public investment projects assess their gender impacts. Together, these indicators ask whether gender is considered before resources are allocated. The next 2 indicators, they are during the budget preparation, GRPFM3, Gender Responsive Budget Circular. It assesses whether the budget circular provides guidance on addressing gender issues. And GRPFM4, Gender Responsive Budget Proposal Documentation, it examines whether budget proposal documents include information on gender priorities and measures. The key question here is whether decision makers have gender relevant information when preparing and approving the budget. And now after budget preparation comes the execution and monitoring stage. GRPFM5, 6 disaggregated performance information for service delivery, focuses on whether performance information for service delivery is sex disaggregated. And GRPFM6, Tracking Budget Expenditure for Gender Equality, assesses whether governments can identify and track expenditures related to gender equality. These indicators ask whether governments can follow the money and understand who benefits from the public spending. The final stage is the reporting, evaluation, and oversight. So GRPFM7, Gender Responsive Reporting, looks at whether governments publish gender responsive budget reports. GRPFM8, Evaluation of Gender Impacts of Service Delivery, examines whether the gender impacts of services are evaluated. And GRPFM9, Legislative Scrutiny of Gender Impacts of the Budget, assesses whether legislatures scrutinize gender impacts during budget approval and oversight. Together, these indicators ask whether gender is part of accountability, evaluation, and legislative scrutiny. So this is the framework in short. As you see here, this is a map that shows you, how many PEFA gender assessments have been done as of to date, as of April 2026, and the geographical scope. So we have so far 53 assessments, 33 of them annexes, which we mean like they are part of a PEFA Plus or PEFA Plus Plus assessment. So they are annexed to a PEFA national assessment. Part of them are finalized. I think 40 are finalized. 7 of those are subnational, and the rest are draft and planned. So I don't know if you can see it, if it's that big on screen or not, but the coverage spans all regions. So this is illustrating that gender responsive PFM is a global reform priority, not confined to specific income group. The mix of finalized draft and planned assessments also show that PEFA gender is increasingly being mainstreamed into PEFA processes, providing a growing evidence base for reform dialogue involving governments, parliaments, and civil society. Coming to the last slide. So in March 2025, we reviewed the completed PEFA assessment so far. So from inception, since January 2020 to March 2025, there were 32 final published PEFA gender assessments. We reviewed them. The overall conclusion was that these assessments establish a global baseline where countries stand today, or where countries stand in March 2025, where gaps remain, and how gender responsive PFM can be strengthened. So the conclusion was like most systems are still at an early stage of integrating gender into core PFM processes. Only a small number have embedded gender requirements into core tools such as budget circulars or annual reporting frameworks. A key global weakness is gender impact analysis of new policies consistent with broader OECD and IMF findings that only a few countries apply advanced gender practices systematically. I'll stop here because Maya will continue with more details on this review and other important information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mona. Yeah, thank you so much for this very clear and insightful presentation. And I'm so happy to see the map that you showed with us. It's amazing to see that apparently the geography of gender PEFA is increasing. And we really hope that we will see more and more in the upcoming years. And I really loved when you said that we need to follow the money. Unless we will be able to follow the money, then we will not be able to properly identify where the gaps are. But I want to reiterate again what was said in the opening remarks, that it's gender responsive budgeting is not a sprint, it's a process. And you very rightly said that most systems are still in the early stage. And we really hope that we will push more, like all international organizations and governments as well, and civil society, parliaments, supreme audit institutions, to properly make them to be even not in a spring, but to not in the early stage, but to properly mature in this field. Let me now invite Maya Bosnich, also from PEFA Secretariat, to take us deeper into the conceptual frameworks, foundations of gender responsive PFM, and the role of civil society organizations. Maya, the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Mira, and hello to all the colleagues and all the participants around the screen. I have to say, first of all, it's really such a pleasure to see a lot of familiar names around the screen in participants as well. I can see a lot of colleagues who have a lot to contribute, including on gender responsive PFM. Also to say, I did have a short presentation that unfortunately now I cannot share, but I hope this will not be a constraint for us. Unless some of the colleagues would love to share my presentation, please be my guest. But without further ado, and for the sake of the time, I would just like maybe to pick up, first of all, to say what we have heard in introduction, what Ms. Francesca already shared. I mean, I would just like to reiterate all these important aspects of gender responsive PFM. And I think maybe just to pick up on several points, and then I will also, thank you so much, Mira, for sharing. Just first to say a few things to start with. First, we have already said that PEFA gender as assessment is a diagnostic, and we have all confirmed that diagnostic is only the beginning. I also have to say, for all of us who have been working with gender responsive PFM for quite some time, introduction of gender responsive PEFA assessment as a tool was actually very, very welcomed, because we had on one place very clearly outlined the steps and entry points for inclusion of gender equality across the budget cycle. So it's a very clear, if we wish, a guidance on how would we like to introduce gender equality in all the stages of budget cycle, as Mona have rightfully said. Francesca also highlighted one point that I also would like to reiterate, and that is that public financial management is not the only tool to achieve gender equality, of course. So this is just one of the leverages that we have. We also have the legislative framework, we have the system of norms, we have a very political nature of gender equality. So all of that together with the public financial management system is leading to gender outcomes. As Mona said, PEFA assessment is there to really diagnose how well is gender integrated in the PFM institution and processes, but it's not measuring the outcomes for gender equality. This is really important to highlight here. And maybe before I go into these several slides, also just to say, as Mona noted, a year ago we have done the assessment of all the PEFA gender assessments that have been done to that date. Now there is even more, so there is more body of knowledge. But it was also very clear that the opportunity to analyze new policies, both expenditure and revenue policy from gender perspective, that is a missed opportunity. So if we would start from that point on, then it would be much clearer as to how, what kind of gender impact policies can have. And the other missed opportunity, if I may say, is also legislative scrutiny of the budget, which is also underused tool or opportunity, if we wish, across the countries. So these are these two things that have become very clear in the assessments. Now, this slide, I think, is very familiar to all of us. Of course, gender gaps are not just the social issues, they are part of the budget outcomes. And if we wish to have equitable budget outcomes, then of course, gender responsive PFM is the way to go. We have already heard that PFM system decides what gets funded, who benefits, and what is measured. So there is a strong element of accountability. And without gender responsive PFM, all of our gender policies remain, of course, aspirational. I'm looking at Ermira here. I have heard you saying many times, it's just the letter on the paper. It's not really de facto gender equality that we are having. So inequalities in that way become fiscally embedded. So we can move to the next slide, because of course, budgets are an important tool for redistribution and for gender impact as well. What is very important is that PEFA assessments are highlighting the opportunities throughout the budget cycle, budget formulation, execution, reporting, and audit. And then we are also having a very strong element of service delivery, performance information that we are measuring, both in the reporting stage and the planning stage, and performance orientation. So we are able to see how well are outcomes related to gender objectives. So in this context, and I will soon turn to international budget partnership, because you will be talking, Sally, much more about the role of civil society, but I just want to introduce that aspect here. And just to say that in all the budget reforms and in order to achieve the budget outcomes, of course, the role of civil society is crucial. But in gender responsive budgeting, that role becomes even more important, because the crucial element that often misses, that is often missed in ministries of finance and line ministries, is the element of gender analysis, the capacity to really understand what are the gender issues. And in this context, our allies from civil society organizations have become a very, very important partner when it comes to the body of knowledge of the key gender gaps and challenges, and also a source of data. So civil society is in that context not an add-on, especially not in gender responsive PFM. It is really systems critical. I will reiterate again accountability in the element of scrutinizing budgets and execution. I have just noted that a legislative element is often missing in a sense of legislative scrutiny, and therefore the role of civil society organizations become even more important. We are always saying that civil society, of course, brings lived realities into fiscal debates. I have a lot of good examples from all over the world of, for example, when we were doing the analysis of HIV and health-related gender inequalities and the health issues, how much the role and the knowledge of civil society was important. Mira, thank you for moving the slides and thank you for setting up the pace as the excellent moderator does. So we are now looking at some of the pictures from South Africa. I just wanted to pull one example, and I'm sure that Sally has many, many more due to the good work of International Budget Partnership. But in the next slide, we can see actually that South Africa, for example, is a very good example of gender responsive budgeting work. But in particular, when it comes to the budget, Mira, do we have a next slide? Yes, thank you. So the Women Budget Initiative, that is a civil society organization that is doing the budget watching from gender perspective, influence directly parliamentary scrutiny of budgets. And there we are coming back to the actual reason of being of gender budgeting, which is, of course, to achieve gender objectives, which is, of course, to reduce gender gaps. And here we are seeing exactly the steps that were done in order to extend, for example, child support grant expansion. That was exactly done with the analytical work of Women Budget Initiative that was then fed into the budget debates and the financing. Health sector reprioritization, budget transparency shift, etc., etc. I would stop here. I am very mindful of time and I'm very eager to leave a space and time for discussion. So Sally, I think this is really a great time for you to pick up, but Mira, I am not before I turn the microphone. And thank you so much for sharing the slides.
Maya, thank you so much. It's amazing. I'm like, it really, your presentation was excellent, and it really reminded us on very clearly that public finance is not gender neutral, and the way how budgets are designed, implemented, and monitored shapes whether the policy commitment on gender equality are translated into real change. And you already started to talk about scrutiny and accountability and transparency. So, and it gives me such a good entry points to introduce our next speaker. So I will turn now to Sally Torbert, which comes from the International Budget Partnership, who will share perspectives on how gender-responsive PFM contributes to more transparent, participatory, and equitable budget outcomes. Sally, over to you.
Thank you very much, Edmira, and a big thank you to the PEFA Secretariat for inviting me to be part of this very interesting discussion on the PEFA Gender Framework. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the International Budget Partnership, we are an organization that collaborates with civil society groups around the world, and specifically helping them engage with governments and with oversight institutions to make public finance systems more transparent, more participatory, more accountable, and more importantly, more equitable. And so even as our work spans from budget transparency and accountability, we also work on issues like tax equity, debt accountability, and broader civil society engagement in PFM reforms to improve service delivery outcomes. And for us, gender equity cuts across all of these lines of work. And so I couldn't have actually been introduced better than by Maya's remarks just a few moments ago about what is the role of CSOs in trying to promote more equitable outcomes, especially on gender equity. And I'll flag that for many CSOs, it's not just that we're looking for more gender responsive public services, but we really are talking about gender responsive, broader fiscal systems. And that's why I think for us, it's so important to be talking about this whole of PFM approach that the PEFA Gender Framework helps us understand. And so I think what I'll frame by talking about really what is it when we're talking about gender equitable PFM systems. And so for us, I think you've heard, even as Mona shared, it's not just spent, right? A lot of times we're looking at the budget allocations, and that's where most people really often start for gender responsive budgeting. But for us, we actually really see the whole system as contributing to whether or not there's gender equity in a PFM system. So on the revenue side, fiscal systems really can entrench inequality even before there's a single shilling or peso or naira who's spent. And that actually many low and middle income countries actually depend heavily on indirect taxes, things like value-added taxes or VAT, which can fall disproportionately on lower income households, especially where women are overrepresented. So if you're trying to then increase your domestic resource mobilization, the design of your personal income tax, how you structure tax expenditures, whether or not there are exemptions on extractive or corporate sectors, these all shape how much fiscal space actually exists for the services that women rely on, but also who carries the burden of funding that. And tax administration itself is also gendered. So women who work in areas like informal trade, in particular, they often face disproportionate compliance costs and sometimes even harassment when they're asked to pay taxes. Right now, we're also really worried about debt. Everyone's talking about debt these days, but it's not just debt. It can be good, it can be bad, but right now we're worried about moments where, for example, more countries are spending more on debt service than they are sometimes on health and education combined. And so we worry about things like when debt service crowds out social spending, or when fiscal consolidation cuts social protection or care infrastructure, because those costs are disproportionately absorbed by women and girls. And so here we're talking about longer queues at clinics, or families pulling their girls out of school, or expanded unpaid care work in households. But on the spending side, this is a whole system. We see that often, I think, as you heard at the beginning, as Francisca said, that often the policy rhetoric is greater than the actual spending that's allocated. But then if you look even further, budget execution also falters, specifically in programs and sectors that promote greater gender equity. And we actually did a bit of research on this a couple of years ago, where we looked at 13 countries, not a huge sample, but in the 13 that we looked at, we analyzed whether spending on gender-related programs and other social sectors, how that compared with overall budget execution rates. And we actually found that gender was one of the sectors that actually was underspent by a higher degree than the average kind of budget execution rate. So this shows you that sometimes it's not just enough to look at what was allocated. You actually need to track it across the entire expenditure cycle. And then on the oversight side, we've also seen that gender priorities only hold, as we've heard, when legislatures, supreme audit institutions, but importantly, civil society, also have the information that they need, but also the standing and the space to scrutinize across the budget cycle whether or not the government's living up to its commitments. And when these accountability systems are weak, that's when gender commitments are most easily reversed. So for us, this means gender responsive PFM means embedding equity across all these stages of the budget cycle, not just in budget tagging or in a single gender program line. So we wanted to share a bit more data. So this is if you might not know, IBP also does a research instrument called the Open Budget Survey, and it's actually a complementary instrument to PEFA. It is not as detailed as PEFA, but it actually is harmonized with the PEFA framework in that we've tried to build on international standards. It's an international comparable assessment of budget transparency, public participation, and oversight in the budget cycle. It's conducted by CSOs, and we historically have done it every 2 years, only based on information that's in the public domain. But our most recent round was in OBS 2023. We actually have a new one coming out this year, so be prepared for more data coming soon. But on the sample size of 125 countries where we looked, we actually only have one indicator in the entire assessment. I'll get to how we're going to expand this, but we actually do have an indicator that looks at whether or not in the budget proposal there is a display of the gender distribution of expenditures. And actually what we found is only 31 countries in the ones that we looked at actually say anything about gender in the budget proposal or show how expenditures impact different groups differently. So that's only 1 in 4 countries. which means it can be really hard from the outside to really understand even how the government is planning to spend along gender equity lines. And so what we're talking about there are things like a gender budget statement, a dedicated section within the budget speech or the main budget document, or even a standalone gender tagged classification of expenditure. So that kind of gives us a takeaway of saying, okay, we've got some information, but not necessarily enough. And I'll just kind of give a shout out to our forthcoming Open Budget Survey 2025, which we're actually in the process of releasing now. So stay tuned for more results over the coming months. But in that, we actually introduced, in part building off of the PEFA Gender Framework, a new non-scored question that asked researchers to identify which gender responsive budgeting practices are implemented across the budget cycle. And so we will hopefully release more information on this soon, but just like the PEFA gender assessment goes beyond PEFA, the OBS2 is trying to start collecting more data on practices across the budget cycle, not just at the planning phase. So here I'd just like to flag, I think based on what Maya said, just a plug for what civil society can add to the discussion on gender equity and PFM at country level. And I'm saying this especially to our government counterparts on the call, hopefully to inspire you to think about ways that you can collaborate with CSOs in your country if you're doing a PEFA gender assessment. We see, for example, as I flagged, on gender budget credibility, on the gap between gender allocations and what's actually executed. Many CSOs are analyzing this information, bringing it to legislatures, suggesting it should be audited. So this is an area that CSOs really add, even as it adds to even what the PEFA gender assessment does itself. We also really are doing analysis of tax equity in terms of what is the impact of tax equity policies. Then you see public participation. So you heard about this gap in legislative scrutiny, but we would say even beyond legislative scrutiny, that's not a substitute for direct engagement of women's organizations and feminist movements in fiscal policy itself. Because what we're really looking for there are meaningful opportunities for the public. And when we say the public, all of the public, women, men, all different groups, to be able to shape tax policies, budget formulation, monitor execution, and see what audits say about public spending. The fourth is intersectionality. And that oftentimes we don't really have enough data, especially sex disaggregated data, to surface the experience of different groups. And here we're talking about the experience of Indigenous women, adolescents, rural women, especially women in conflict affected areas. So these are the things that you might not necessarily even see in a PEFA gender assessment, but CSOs can add when they're talking to governments and to other actors in society around their experiences around gender equity. So I'll even give you, we're short on time, but I'll give you just a few small examples of how this works in practice. And you heard Maya say, talking about centering citizen voice and citizen experience. I'll share an example from Morocco, where we have a partner called the Association Démocratique des Femmes du Maroc, or ADFM, that's gone beyond Morocco's very well-established gender budget reporting, and they've been engaging on the finance law itself. So in 2024 and 2025, they actually helped convene a multi-stakeholder dialogue on the public finance framework, and they supported women parliamentarians from different political parties to review the finance law through a gender lens, and they secured commitments to introduce gender-responsive budgeting amendments in subsequent finance laws. I'll talk about an example from Guatemala, where there's a CSO called, excuse my pronunciation, but Observatorio en Salud Reproductiva, where they've been documenting for more than a decade on the alcohol tax earmark that's supposed to be going and funding spending on sexual and reproductive health. But it actually, in practice, it's been unevenly executed. And there's been stockouts that they've tracked, which are specifically concentrated in rural and indigenous regions. So even though there was this statutory earmarking that actually did try to increase financing, it was the civil society monitoring of that execution who actually could identify who actually benefits from that spending. So I'll just say, as I close out, that I think what we're hoping to flag is 2 points from today's discussion. is that we really do want to encourage CSOs that have joined today to see PEFA gender assessments as potential ways to engage with PFM systems on issues of gender equity. And you can do that in different ways. You can contribute to assessments in certain cases, but definitely as users of findings and advocacy and engagement with budgets. But importantly, as we've been hearing today, thinking about using PEFA gender assessments as an entry point around reform dialogue. Because as Mona said, there are 53 assessments that are either available or will soon be available to engage with. And if your country doesn't have one, perhaps you can ask them to do one. So thanks very much, and back to you, Amira.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you so much. I see we are almost running out of time, but we are still in control. And with these 2 points, I want to move to the question and discussions part. I'm very happy to see we will start with great news from Elizabeth, which is saying that the new gender PEFA is coming up in Mexico. So hooray for Mexico, huge applause. And we have few comments and questions, which I would go one by one. First, it's Claudie. Some countries started gender responsive budgeting before they carried out a PEFA gender. The other way around for other countries, in your experience, which way works best? Are all GRB and PEFA gender processes connected in an efficient way? Then I will go to the next question. The next question is about the GRPFM does not take into account the quality of gender analysis, which is in the case of GRB, it's crucial for ensuring substantive rather than merely symbolic results. What do you think? Could this allow government to get away with high scores without necessarily meeting quality standards? And then from Rezard, Rezard is saying that he works with EU member states administration, and he observed that unfortunately the space for civil society input into budget planning management and consultation process is often quite limited. Do you see this as a new or emerging trend, or as a persistent structural challenge across administration? And in your views, what would be the most effective way to engage and convince public administration to involve civil society more meaningfully in budget process? In particular, at which stages of the budget cycle do you see civil society engagement as most valuable? I see, I'm just going through, and Claudia is saying that I'm working on GRB at local level. Do you think PEFA gender can be adjusted to local authorities? So I'm returning back to the panelists. If you want to take the space and you do a summary while you are taking the floor and responding to some of the key issues which are raised in the chat. Yes, Maya.
Yes, a little finger. Well, I just wanted, because I would love to touch upon all the questions, but I will not. I can see that some of them are already answered. I would maybe just like to, because the question that Marga asked is a very relevant question. It's talking about the quality, and it's talking about, are we measuring the quality of outcomes or even outputs in the PEFA framework? And even in the broader PEFA framework, we are capturing the existence of institutions and processes, and in gender PEFA, it's very similar. So we are measuring, is the gender analysis systematically done? We are not asking whether the analysis is of a good quality. That would require some sort of deeper drill down. However, I think it's very, very important to say there is a narrative part of the report. That part is essentially equally important, I would say, because that's where we are depicting the story, and that is a place where we can reflect on the quality. I'm looking here, we are having the colleagues from Indonesia who have done PEFA gender assessment. They are about to repeat it, I hope. But there were some indicators that actually indeed scored very high, but we did reflect that the quality is needs to be improved. So that's a bit the answer to that question.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks a lot. Any other of the panelists would like to take the
I
floor?
can answer, I think the first one or something. That
Yes.
I think it's about GRB first or PEFA gender first, something like this. I think if, you know, if there is a GRB first, that's better, because then PEFA gender tends to work better, because there are real systems and practices to assess. And where PEFA gender comes first, it is useful mainly as a diagnostic to guide GRB reforms. So GRB and PEFA gender are often not well connected. I don't know, Maya might correct me, but I mean, I think overall, alignment only works when PEFA gender results are actively used to shape the GRB reform roadmap.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. Thank you so much. Now to Sally. Sally, you're the last one because we have to move.
Yes, and I would like to respond to Rezar's question from the EU member state administration's great one. And I will say this, that we do see that the open budget survey has 3 pillars, and one of them is public participation. And actually over 2 decades that we've done the open budget survey, we do see public participation as structurally the weakest of the 3 pillars that we measure. And generally the practices are well behind transparency and oversight practices. And that said, we have seen progress. And so it is an area that we do see governments making an effort to improve. And I'll give you a few reasons why, in terms of your question around where does it make sense to make the most investment in participation? The first is that we don't see participation as a cost, but really kind of also as a risk management around this question of inclusivity, but critically legitimacy. Because if you've got a government that is consulting meaningfully on very difficult fiscal decisions, and here we've seen this, reactions to tax reforms or tax increases, they don't go ahead if you don't really fully meaningfully engage with citizens and explain why you need to do this. And so without engagement, the political cost of reform is often paid afterwards, right? So in many ways, participation is building legitimacy for the fiscal policies you're trying to promote. Second is that I think it's also recognizing that the communities and civil society have information that you as a Ministry of Finance or a line ministry may not have, especially around what's happening at the service delivery level. So opening up channels for that feedback actually really can help you to be more efficient and effective in the way that you spend. And I'll say that in terms of where those investments are most effective, I would say that obviously, as I say, CSOs and communities definitely have a lot of value to add in making spender more effective and reach people in ways that you might not be aware of as a government around execution monitoring and especially around service delivery monitoring. But if you want to build legitimacy, that's at formulation. That's specifically what we call the pre-budget stage, even before the budget priorities have been decided, saying what is it that we're doing that we're translating into the budget. That's a very key moment for building legitimacy around the policies you want to promote. So, but the critical point there is to make it meaningful, symbolic, and truly inclusive, not just select groups, but groups that represent all different views, including gender groups. So yeah, back to you, Amira.
Thank you so much, Sally. Before we are going to closing remarks, I just want to read loud what Lilian is writing, because I cannot agree more of what she is writing, that this means we are not just talking about adding gender tools, but also ensuring coherence across the entire cycle, from formulation to execution, reporting and oversight. And she's saying that she's curious how others are thinking about maintaining that continuity in practice, which I have to admit, it's absolutely what she's saying. It's absolutely right and correct. And I think everyone agreed with them. So thank you very much for these rich discussions. Before we close, I would like to invite Mr. Serdar Yilmaz from the World Bank, which PEFA is housed, to share closing reflections. Mr. Serdar, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you, colleagues. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I thank all of you, all of our panelists, Amira, Sally, Maya, Mona, all of you. Thank you for your contributions. And I would like to acknowledge Francisca's contribution as well. Her remarks set the tone for the discussions, and especially her quick toll of our practice on PFM related issues as far as gender is concerned. This webinar came at an opportune time as we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of PEFA. As Francisca said, PEFA is now a young adult, maybe a mature adult, depending how you characterize. But I think what's important is gender responsive PFM is not a niche topic. It is very relevant to achieving outcomes and results, especially in certain sectors. So I really value all the examples and information that the panelists share with us today. One thing I want to emphasize is the World Bank is firmly committed to supporting its client countries in integrating gender considerations into PFM systems, as well as service delivery in terms of benefits, in terms of distribution of those services. In that context, I value the collaboration between UN Women and IBP with our PEFA Secretariat. Hopefully, we will be organizing more events and more PEFA gender assessments jointly. Lastly, I want to thank my colleagues at the PEFA Secretariat who worked hard on this webinar, and hopefully we are going to have more than 53 assessments next time we have the webinar. Thank you, Armira, for moderating the session ably, and we have benefited from the knowledge of all of you. And hopefully, as I said, next time we get together, we will have 153 assessments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yilmaz. And thank you to all our speakers and participants for these very engaging discussions, especially in this particularly important in today's context where fiscal space is constrained and choices about resource allocations are becoming even more critical. We all agree that progress on gender equality is not only about policies, it's about whether those policies are financed or not. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to continue this important work together and have a wonderful holiday. Bye.